One of the easiest mistakes small business leaders make is this. They assume silence means clarity. There are no questions, no pushback. There appears to be no confusion because no one is asking for help. So leadership assumes we explained it well. But in reality, something very different is often happening. A lot of employees stop asking questions long before they actually feel confident, especially after being corrected publicly or getting inconsistent answers or feeling rushed or being made to feel like they should already know something or watching other employees get frustrated responses. Eventually, employees start making a quiet operational calculation. It's probably safer to guess. That is where businesses often start misreading workplace behavior because guessing can look a lot like confidence at first, especially when employees keep moving, the shift keeps running, nobody wants to slow things down. So, operationally, the business keeps functioning, but underneath the surface, employees are starting to navigate uncertainty silently. And that creates a very different workplace dynamic than leadership usually realizes. Because now employees are no longer operating from clarity, they're operating from risk management, and that changes behavior fast. This is where businesses often miss the deeper issue. Leaders usually assume employees stop asking questions because they understand, or they feel confident, or they're becoming independent, or they're fully trained. But the truth is, in many workplaces, employees stop asking questions because they are trying to avoid friction, especially in fast moving workplaces when managers respond differently, answers change depending on who they ask, or they get corrected after following someone else's instructions, or clarification feels emotionally risky. In these environments, employees eventually start learning something dangerous. Not how should this actually be handled, but how do I avoid looking incompetent? That is a completely different psychological environment because now uncertainty becomes hidden instead of visible. And hidden uncertainty creates operational inconsistency that leadership often cannot immediately trace. And the operation quietly develops behavioral workarounds instead of operational clarity. That is where a lot of businesses unknowingly start training hesitation. You usually can see this happening in very small moments. An employee rereads the same message 3 times before responding, or someone pauses before answering a customer question because they're trying to remember which manager gave which instruction, or an employee says, I just wanted to double check something, even though they already asked that same question last week. Another employee waits for a coworker to approve a decision that they technically already have the authority to make. Or another employee becomes the unofficial safe person that everybody goes to for clarification, not because they're a supervisor, but because they explain things without making people feel stupid. And eventually, employees start learning the emotional geography of the workplace. They learn who reacts impatiently, who explains things calmly, who changes expectations frequently, who expects employees to just know, who gets frustrated by follow up questions. Employees are constantly adapting to the changing environment, and over time, that adaptation starts creating emotional vigilance. They spend a lot of energy monitoring personalities instead of focusing fully on the work. That kind of workplace adaptation creates hidden cognitive load, and eventually, uncertainty stops feeling temporary and it starts feeling normal. Questions become delayed, mistakes become hidden, clarification becomes selective, employees stop exposing the uncertainty early. And then leadership reads this as avoidable mistakes or inconsistent execution or repeated confusion, hesitation, dependency, recurring corrections. But they are often seeing the result of hidden uncertainty, not the original cause. Guessing creates operational instability in ways businesses often underestimate because when employees are unsure, they usually do one of 3 things: they guess, they avoid, or they overconfirm. And none of those behaviors scales cleanly. Guessing creates inconsistency, avoidance creates bottlenecks, and overconfirmation creates dependency. So, since decisions begin taking longer than they should, managers are repeating the same corrections constantly. Initiative becomes inconsistent because employees are no longer fully trusting their own judgment, and accountability starts feeling unstable from one situation to the next. In many cases, employees are not lacking the initiative. Instead, they are managing uncertainty. And that distinction matters because businesses often accidentally create environments where employees become more afraid of being wrong than they are motivated to be effective. And once that starts happening, workplace behavior changes dramatically. Employees stop experimenting, they stop speaking confidently, they stop acting independently because uncertainty became emotionally expensive. And over time, that emotional cost compounds quietly. People become more cautious over time. Mental overload increases. Employees start depending more heavily on reassurance before acting. Strong employees start compensating for unstable clarity. Managers start carrying more decision making manually. And eventually, the operation starts depending on emotional adaptation instead of structural consistency. That creates a workplace where everybody stays busy, but fewer people actually feel confident. That slows everything down, not visibly at first, but definitely psychologically and structurally. Now, mature operations understand something important. They understand that employees are constantly reading the workplace emotionally, not just operationally. They're paying attention to reactions and tone and consistency and correction patterns, emotional safety, reinforcement, because every workplace trains behavior. The only question is whether the training is happening intentionally or by accident. Mature leaders understand that uncertainty does not disappear just because employees become quiet. Sometimes those quiet employees are the least clear people in the operation. They have simply learned to survive uncertainty in silence. And over time, that silence becomes dangerous to the operation because leadership starts losing visibility into where the uncertainty actually exists, and employees stop exposing the confusion early. So mistakes don't surface until much later downstream, and operational drift spreads quietly. Managers assume understanding that does not actually exist. Over time, employees start focusing more on avoiding correction than actually understanding the expectation. And that, my friend, is not operational confidence. That is operational self protection. And the longer that environment continues, the more emotional adaptation starts replacing operational stability. Employees stop focusing on learning the work itself, and now they are also learning safe behaviors, safe timing, safe personalities, safe communication patterns. That is where leadership trust slowly starts eroding, because over time, employees stop trusting that the expectations are going to remain stable. They stop feeling confident that clarification will actually feel safe, and eventually, even success starts feeling unpredictable from one situation to the next. Eventually, the operation starts depending heavily on memory, on interpretation, on emotional monitoring, and strong employees compensating quietly for the instability. That is a much more fragile system than most businesses realize. So, mature operations start paying attention to different signals. Not just are employees asking questions, but are employees asking the same questions repeatedly? Are employees hesitating before routine decisions? Are certain managers receiving fewer questions than others? Are employees seeking clarification privately instead of publicly? Are strong employees becoming the unofficial translators? Are employees emotionally adapting before leadership notices? Because those patterns usually reveal something deeper than performance problems. They often reveal clarity in stability. This is where mature operations start viewing workplace behavior differently, because once employees begin managing uncertainty silently, the issue is no longer communication alone. Now the operation itself is shaping behavior psychology. Employees start becoming more cautious, more approval dependent, more hesitant to act without reassurance because the workplace trained unpredictability into the experience. And over time, that unpredictability changes how people participate inside the operation. And the leadership challenge changes completely. The question now is no longer simply whether the expectations were communicated. The deeper question becomes, what has this operation repeatedly trained people to expect? Because workplaces are always reinforcing something. Sometimes they reinforce clarity, sometimes they reinforce caution, and sometimes they reinforce emotional self protection. And eventually, those reinforcement patterns become workplace culture because employees adapted to what felt safest operationally. That is why mature operations become extremely intentional about reinforcement, correction patterns, expectation stability, emotional predictability, because stable operations do more than improve performance. They reduce the amount of emotional adaptation people need just to function consistently. And that is a very different leadership standard. A lot of businesses do not realize that hidden uncertainty is spreading until the operation starts feeling harder to run than it should. And leadership often experiences all of that as frustration. But underneath it, the operation may be dealing with something much deeper. Employees no longer fully trust their own understanding. That is where mature leaders slow down and start looking more carefully at the environment itself. Not just the mistake, not just the employee, not just the outcome, the environment, because uncertainty spreads differently depending on what the workplace reinforces. Operational maturity does not mean employees need less guidance. Operational maturity is really about employees needing less emotional risk to get clarity. That is a very different conversation because unstable operations do not just create inconsistency. Over time, they actually shape human behavior. Employees become more hesitant, more cautious, more politically aware, more emotionally vigilant, and eventually the workplace starts spending more energy adapting to instability than improving performance. That is the hidden human cost of operational inconsistency because employees should not have to decode personalities, guess expectations, manage emotional reactions, or hide uncertainty silently. The operation itself should create recognizable clarity, not through constant supervision or emotional guesswork or employees trying to read personalities all day long. It happens through reinforcement that stays recognizable even when pressure increases. Because stable operations change the emotional experience of the workplace. Over time, people stop second guessing themselves constantly. Questions will start surfacing earlier, expectations start feeling more recognizable, and confidence becomes less dependent on which manager happens to be working today. That is what operational maturity actually creates over time. Not perfect workplaces, but more stable ones. And that is why, my friends, better systems build better workplaces.